Please like and subscribe to this podcast. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a good review or even share with somebody else. It helps us reach as many people as possible.
At the beginning of it, I feel like a drink, but in the middle of it, I need a drink.
What you're feeling is valid and real and is likely to grow.
And that's why we need to bring it back to say, okay, fair enough, you are part of a family, or are you? Okay, Lou, what are we going to talk about today?
Okay, $1 million question. Is my loved one an alcoholic or am I making a fuss?
Okay, there are two ways of looking at this. One is the sort of the objective way, which is the way the professionals would look at it. They would use their diagnostic tests, and normally the most powerful one of these is the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's how they diagnose almost any mental disorder, right? And that's the gold standard as far as figuring out whether somebody is an alcoholic or not. And then we're also going to look at it from a much more subjective, which is the way the families look at it. You know, it's how you experience it. Okay.
I think I would have needed both, really. The science.
Yeah.
When I was two people in this, I went to be armed with my scientific statements with little things so that I could just tell my husband just exactly how wrong he was getting it. Or sometimes I would look at it and I was thinking, no, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him. I can go away. So I sometimes underread it and overread it.
I think most people do that. I mean, I think most people look for this objective measurement. You know, if I find out he or she's an alcoholic, then I could just turn around and go, look, definitely you have to change.
Caught you.
You know?
Yeah.
And so they're looking for that particular piece of paper, you know, that diagnosis, which they feel will change everything.
Yeah. And remember the dance that goes on, and I think it's really important at the outset you understand this. The drinker is minimising all the time, so you often get you go almost to the opposite extreme, and you end up over-focusing on everything, which then your drinker accuses you of doing, and therefore overplaying everything. So you go through this dance, which we will talk about later.
And that's what we will come to. In the DSM, there's a whole heap of questions. Now, alcoholism is seen as a syndrome. Now, a syndrome means that there can be a whole heap of symptoms of it, but you don't have to have all of them. But if you have enough, then you can be diagnosed as being an alcoholic, or should we say a dependent drinker, because we tend to use problem drinker or dependent drinker rather than alcoholic these days.
Okay.
For numerous reasons. But
so this will feel like a questionnaire to me.
It is a questionnaire, you know. But the first one is drinking more than intended or for longer periods.
Okay.
You know?
Well,
Now, I know that for me, that was something that used to happen quite a lot, you know, that I would go out for a drink, you know, and end up drinking far, far more. You know, for example, I mean, I would go out at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night and come back in August, you know. It was the way it tended to happen with me because I'm only going for one and I meant it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not one, but two, you know, but certainly not a lot and certainly not a binge. So that was part of the hallmark of it, is that a person is drinking more than they intended and for longer periods. Now, funnily enough, as we go through this objective criteria, what we don't find is a number. You know, if you drink 10 drinks, then you're an alcoholic. It doesn't work like that. It's more about the behaviour.
Okay.
Okay.
That's why we call it problem drinking.
Then there's the big one. Wanting to quit drinking but being unable to, despite efforts.
Yeah, and this often there's a cycle, certainly with us. There was a binge, there was an outcry, and then there was a stopping.
Yeah.
Everyone relieved, and then the starting again.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that you find with this one is that, you know, you say this to you're a drinker, you need to stop. And you go, I could stop any time I want.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you? Well, I don't want to,
That's another.
But if I did want to, I could, and that's
okay, but this is observing rather than the drinker. Someone looking at the drinker, they would say number two, definitely. If you're listening to this, it's almost certain that your drinker is drinking more and your appeals, are going on deaf ears at the moment.
So the next one is spending a lot of time seeking, drinking, or recovering from alcohol use. Now, one of the things I used to say, I remember talking about a conference, and it was a conference of the families of drinkers and drug addicts, and say, it's a full-time job being a drinker or a drug addict. It takes a lot of time because you've got to find the money. You've then got to get your drug, whether it's alcohol or whatever it is, and then you have to consume it, and then you have to recover from it, so it takes a lot of time, and that's time that's taken away from other activities for the family, watching your kids grow up, going to, the kids' football, all that sort of stuff.
What that looks like as a family too is avoiding your drinking, like, if you're a mum, which again we'll talk about later, if there's been a binge, then they're recovering, so you avoid them the next morning, and, all of these things play into that, really.
Yeah. Craving, having intense urges to drink.
You tell us about that then.
Oh, that was awful. At the beginning of drinking, you don't tend to have it. If you've been off the drink. My drinking was, I was a binge drinker. So what I did was I would have long periods where I wouldn't drink, usually about up to 2 months where I would not drink at all. Or if I did drink, I drank, what would appear to be a controlled fashion. But then I did drink, and then I binged, and that would last days, weeks, and then they end up months. My last binge was about 2 months. I was not sober for 2 months. And but at the beginning of it, I feel like a drink, but in the middle of it, I need a drink. And I needed a drink because I had dreadful withdrawal symptoms, and some of those withdrawal symptoms were anxiety and panic attacks.
Right, okay.
And I thought, if I don't get a drink, I will go mad. I'll be insane. And then that's what I felt like. I felt as if I was falling into this huge, sort of black hole behind me, and I would never come back out again unless I got a drink.
My complication was that I knew my husband loved me, so he would kind of stop drinking and I'd leave him for a while, and then I'd appeal, and tell him how difficult it was, and I loved him, the kids found it difficult, all this blah, blah, blah. What I didn't realise for years is that's probably when the cravings started again. Yeah. He just felt absolutely awful, and then the cravings would begin, and it took me a long time to realise the connection.
The people drink, for different reasons. Some people drink to forget. My reason for drinking was that I felt invisible. Now, to explain that, I did not function well in social sort of occasions, or even just in a one-to-one. I was okay in a one-to-one. 1 to 2, I started to be uneasy. On 1 to 3, I was beginning to fade into the background. 1 to 4, etc., etc., etc.
Was shy?
No, it was more than shy.
Was it?
It was more than shy. I was shy, but also felt, as I say, eventually invisible. But I took some alcohol. Hey, I was the life and soul of the party. I was intelligent. I was funny. I was God's gift to women. Surprisingly, the women didn't seem to agree with this, but that's another matter altogether. And funnily enough, nobody agreed that I was funny and interesting or that. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this, what was in here. And that's what the alcohol did. It changed the way I felt about me. So I was no longer invisible. And I loved that,
I mean, the irony is you are actually it as your wife. I know you to be all of those things, but years ago you had to...
Especially God's gift to women. You heard it here at this podcast,
We're moving swiftly on before it has had to go outside the door when we get through. Yeah. Right. being unable to fulfill home, school, work, or social responsibilities. This is as they get worse. There's a lot of functioning, high functioning.
That's something that you might recognise.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that particular one. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that a lot of people who are listening to this podcast will, you know, it's fine, but never there.
Now, with binge drinking, it's a bit more complicated because there is that functioning in between the binge,
Yes.
which looks normal, but it becomes less and less so.
Yeah.
I think with regular drinking, again, the ability to function just gets eroded more and more. There are a lot of people that they have a high function for work,
Yeah.
which then changes when they come home. But there does come a point where it really affects the work.
Well, this is the thing. This is why a lot of problem drinkers will say, I don't have a problem. I go to work, I do this, I do that, you know. But it's not the amount that people drink. It's not how often they drink. The real hallmark of it is the relationship they have with drink. Mm-hmm. You know, so they might not drink all day. They might go to work, you know, hold down a job. But come 1 o'clock, you know, 6 o'clock at night on the dot, they have to go for a drink, or they have to go for a drink on the way home, you know, and not get home till very, very late. And that happens all the time. They cannot do without that drink, and that's the hallmark of it.
So halfway through, we do hope that I'm not making a fuss. Levels are now beginning to go up and up and up. You are not making a fuss.
Absolutely.
That's such an agonising feeling, that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Continuing to drink even though it causes rifts in the relationships.
Yeah, right, okay. No, definitely not making a fuss.
Yes.
Yeah, no. The rift is awful. You know, really awful.
Yeah.
I stay with my husband. I'll talk about that again later, because I knew he absolutely loved me and I loved him.
Yeah.
But, you know, the trust that broke between us, you know, and the intimacy that broke between us was just really, really
Unfortunately, that's one of the big casualties, is trust.
Yeah.
Trust and respect, both of them.
Yeah, please, can I just say, we're here if this is resonating with you, because we flipping understand how it does resonate, and we want to help you and support you. And above all, I think I want people out there to know you're not alone. Yeah. Millions and millions of us all wandering around, wondering what on earth is going on. And I think to be able to define it and to stand with each other is really, really important. So hang on in there. Please come with us on this journey, because we know where you're at. We know what you're going through. And John will be working with drinkers as well, so you can prod them his way. Sorry, that's me going off on one of my heart things.
Quite all right.
So, yeah, you matter to us. You really do matter to us. And that is the truth. Okay. Continuing to drink, knowing it can worsen physical or mental health conditions.
And for many drinkers, that's the case. You know, it's because you have to remember that alcohol is, you know, it's a functional thing. I drink to get something. You know, for me, I drank to feel better about me. Therefore, if physically I was suffering, and I did suffer quite a lot, you know, I mean, at the end of my drinking, I was given 6 months to live. I had liver damage, brain damage, etc. You know, so I think I can safely say that I was drinking to the detriment of my health, but it didn't really matter. It's what was going on in here, and when I had this feeling of falling into this black hole, this pit of despair, then it didn't matter how I felt physically. I needed the drink.
Very hard to watch this, because we watch it with some of our clients, don't we? And, you know, we see the damage that they're doing.
Absolutely.
You know, and staggered how far they can go down that road.
You know, I worked in the alcohol field for a long time, and, you know, the things that I see people do, and I think, how? And I'm an alcoholic. And I've been and done a lot of these things, and I still think, really?
Can we say, because for those who are listening, John's news, when we talk about his, you know, testimony and what happened to him, you know, he was really, really bad, but he completely turned his life around. So, you know, he is a living example of hope. So when you hear statements like that, and you think your drinker's just not caring for himself at all, that was John, and he turned his life around in a very kind of radical way, you know. Yes. So if you feel, hopeless, no, it's not there is, there is hope.
Sign up for that episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, giving up activities with family and friends to spend more time drinking.
Yeah.
Again.
Well, your family circle just gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
It does. Two things happen. One, you don't get invited to places because you know what happened the last time. And the other thing is you don't invite people to you because you're frightened of what's going to go. Yeah. Is he going to drink? Is she going to drink? What's going to happen? We don't know.
That's the worst bit I found about binges. Is I never knew when it was going to happen. Yeah. So it could be perfectly good, and I say come round for the afternoon, and he'll be on the sofa absolutely out off his head. Yeah. So it was really very, very isolating.
Yeah. So, and then the last two are needing to drink more to achieve the same effects, and that's what happens. Drinkers, they start to develop tolerance. Mm. What that means is that if it took 6 drinks to get them to a stage where they felt really sort of drunk, then after time it might take 8 drinks, then 10 drinks, etc. I could drink prodigious amounts of alcohol, and it wasn't really having much effect. And then there comes a point, if the liver becomes compromised, then you stop needing as much drink. Mm. Because the liver is compromised and it can't metabolize it in the same way. So what happens then is that the small amounts of alcohol have huge effects.
And the next one is continuing to drink, even though it puts you in dangerous situations.
Yeah, I was in a lot of dangerous situations. In fact, thinking back in it, I think one of my functions was a punch bag in a lot of pubs. I got assaulted in at least about 3 pubs, at least. I can't remember. Somebody stuck a glass in my face. Mm. I needed the drink and I was still going back and back and back into these situations.
I remember one of the worst experiences of my life. My son, who was about 3, was playing just on the next floor down, but I think it was in his playpen, and I could hear him Googling away. Mm-hmm. My husband was dead drunk on the sofa, so I was up doing a bit of tidying. And then I suddenly realised there was a bit of silence, and then I saw him, mm-hmm. and he'd come up and picked my son out of the thing, said, "Do you want to come for a drive?" And he was literally weaving right down the back of my garden with my son in his arms. Yeah. And I couldn't get there quick enough, and he just went off with him in the car. So, and there's the dilemma of what do we do? Do we tell the police? We'll talk about that because it's such a big issue, isn't it?
It's a huge issue, that one, and it's a really contentious one. I drove a lot when I was drinking, because as I put it at the time, I wasn't fit to walk. Mm. So I would drive,
So anyway, that's a really, really key one.
And I really thought that was a logical thing to say. Mm. Well, not fit to walk, I'll drive. Crazy.
So experiencing withdrawal symptoms when going without alcohol.
Yeah. Delirium tremens. It is the sort of severe form of withdrawal, and it's the alcohol leaving the system. A lot of people experience that. And the two most sort of common ones are shaking, hands shaking. And my hands used to shake a lot. And sweating, just pouring with sweat. Anxiety, panic, there can be convulsions. And if it's full-blown DTs, it can be hallucinations. Mm. I had all of that at the end. I had the hallucinations, I had the convulsions, I had, the whole 9 yards. And if somebody is in full-blown DTs, it can actually be fatal. Mm. People don't realise it, but it is actually more dangerous to come off of alcohol than it is to come off of heroin.
Oh, I didn't realise that. Even I didn't realise that.
No, I'm not saying it's nice to come off heroin, but it's horrible and it is really uncomfortable, but it's not as dangerous. Mm. You can die in the DTs. Mm-hmm. So when I was taken into hospital in the DTs, the first thing they did was they sedated me.
So that's what the professionals say.
If you can say yes to 3 of those, then there's an alcohol problem. Okay. If you can say yes to 6, there's a severe alcohol problem. But if we move on to the subject of how does it feel to be on the other side, Now, this is one of the problems I have with the alcohol field, is that if we look at the objective, it's all about the drinker. It's all about what the drinker does, what the drinker feels, what the drinker is experiencing. But it doesn't take into account that the drinker is part of a family. It's part of a much wider unit. And it's how it's the consequences that the family has to. One of the things that I used to, when I was talking about in the university, and I was talking about what is an alcohol problem, one of the hypothetical questions I used to put was, what if somebody goes to the pub every single night at 6 o'clock, doesn't come back till closing time every single night, but only drinks a half pint? Is that a problem? And people say, well, it's only a half pint, so it can't be an alcohol problem.
Problem to the wife if it's...
Correct. Yeah. And that's the thing. And that's looking at it in a different way. It's looking at it subjectively. It may not be... The person is going there and they're drinking, but that you would never call them an alcoholic. But there is a problem, and it's surrounding alcohol. And that's when we start to look at it quite differently.
And I was saying to someone, actually, I was just in a session with a client and talking about their partner and saying, look, if they were single and living in a flat by themselves, you wouldn't want them to do it. Basically, if they wanted to drink themselves to death, they live only unto themselves. They're drinking. I mean, I know there's wider issues and, don't anyone react to that if their son or something is in that situation. But the point I'm making is but once you come into a family, then your relationship with alcohol impacts every single one in that family. And that's why we call it problem drinking, because often what's not a problem to the drinker, because to them it's minimal, and begins to become a problem to the family, because your partner, first of all, changes. That's the first thing I used to notice with drink. Much more irritable, much more likely to pick a fight, just more evasive. I mean, I just noticed that the relationship began to change. And then one day he just didn't come home. And he rang me from a pub and just said, I'll be home at 9 o'clock. I've got some mates. And he came home a bit what we call squiffy, but I thought, he's just met up with some old mates. And then it happened again, and then it happened again, and then it became more of a pattern. And I began to realise we have a problem here. So that's how it began for me. I'm sure you've got all sorts of different ways of saying that.
I mean, a story I hear on a regular basis is, he's a wonderful person or she's a wonderful person when they're not drinking. They're not violent, they're not abusive. However, we sit on the couch and they're not there. Physically, they're there, but, mentally, emotionally, not there. It could be sitting there with a tailor's dummy. And is that a problem? Yes, of course it's a problem. If you want to have a relationship with somebody, that's very difficult.
So this is a personal family way of looking at things. I mean, you look at the list and you can get 3. Now, you're 3 in terms of something going on I don't like here, maybe different to anyone else's. But if you married someone and then drink enters the situation and that drink begins to change their behaviour, you have a problem drinker. Now, they may not see it that way, but that drink is causing a problem, and that's why we call it problem drinking. And it can happen long before you have your 3. Now, we talked about the 6 bad ones, so it gradually increases, 6, sometimes 12, just goes on and on and on. But the hard thing for us is all the time suddenly your partner is out there swearing blind that nothing is happening, because you've been kind of conned into thinking that there isn't a problem and you're not making a fuss.
Which takes us back to what I was talking about at the beginning, which is, the partner is looking for this piece of paper that says, yes, he or she is an alcoholic, therefore that's all I need to know.
Yes.
As soon as you hand a piece of paper or give them that diagnosis, they say, oh no, I'm not an alcoholic. And I'm not an alcoholic because, and here's all the reasons because. And it's because of the stereotype. I mean, I remember sitting in an alcohol unit and doing a group therapy and saying, okay, tell us, what is an alcoholic? Going around the room, and basically the answer was, not me. That was really what the answer was. And it was, this one was sitting and said, it's a businessman. who runs a big company and has a bar at the end of his office. And I'm going, right, okay, next. But a lot of it was Skid Row. Skid Row. Is that, and I am not in Skid Row. And I don't do that. I don't drink every day. I'm not drunk every day. I'm not this. I'm not that. I'm not the next thing.
That's what's going on. We're comparing them with the person that we married, our partner.
Yes.
And looking at that, they're comparing themselves with the very worst person in the gutter.
Worst person, case scenario, and because of that, it is very difficult to win. And that's why we need to bring it back to say, okay, fair enough. You are part of a family, or are you? Because when you're drinking, you're not doing this. We will go into, at a later date, we will go into a way of actually measuring the alcohol problem within your family, which is called SHARE, which is one of the tools that we have created to start and look at, is there really a problem, and what is the problem, and then what can we actually do about it?
Yeah. So are you making a fuss? I hope you know that you're not now. I hope you've heard that every journey is different. And I hope you've picked up the fact that if the problem drinking starts, even just in a little way, then that is beginning to disrupt your marriage, and, absolutely feeling upset about that, even though the minimisation is probably going on with your partner. What you're feeling is valid and real and is likely to grow, because often the drinking grows. So what do we take away from this?
Well, what we take away from this is that there are two ways of looking at the problem. There's the objective.
Yeah.
And the objective really is the professional way, but generally looks at the individual and only the individual. That's why, a lot of treatment agencies, it's only the individual that goes, and they don't really deal with the family itself. Now, okay, that will tell you whether the person objectively has a problem, whether they are dependent. But there's also the subjective, and the subjective one is the effect on the family. It's looking at the wider sort of eco-culture that person is living in, how that alcohol affects that family. Does it affect their relationships? Does it affect their finances? Does it affect? And it affects quite a lot in there. And normally speaking, if somebody comes to me and says, does my partner have an alcohol problem? I say, well, yeah, I don't need to know anything about it, but probably if you're asking this question, then it's almost certainly the answer is yes. Yeah. So by the time you come here, no, you're not making a fuss, because you're looking for answers.
Yeah, and to evaluate what's going on.
But what we can tell you is that having a diagnosis is probably not enough. You need to look at it in a wider way. And that's one of the things that we do in Bottled Up. We look at it in a much wider sort of fashion.
Well, thank you so much for listening. Our website again is called bottled-up.com. There's so much information there. There's so many different videos. You'll recognise us on our videos. Do come and join us. And thank you so much for listening.
Goodbye.
Bye.